Today on the Dodge Garage, second verse, same as the first, except it's not at all the same, actually. More on that in a minute. This is not a full rebuild guide video. If you want one of those, go see the video I did on this 440 a few weeks ago. This is the factory 400 block from our 73 Charger project. The car's not here right now to show you, but well, we could just pretend it's this one. I did recently go over to the body shop to check on the progress on that car, so let's cut to that real fast. Sure looks good, doesn't it? The factory 400 block was cleaned and machined by our favorite local machine shop, Johnson Machine. They did go ahead and install the cam bearings for me too, which is great. Although it was a low compression cast crank engine from the factory, the 400 is actually a very popular platform for doing performance builds because it has the biggest bore of any Chrysler big block. It also has the lower deck height though, which means it weighs a little bit less than a 440 and it fits in things better. This engine did require a pretty major cleanup bore. It's finished at 42,000 silver to match the set of pistons we got. One more note on the block here. You may notice the caps actually got a cleanup there. They also got line bored because apparently one of them was a little off in some direction. I didn't get the details on that. Well, you can see just a little hint of the factory Chrysler blue there. This engine will be resprayed in that color, so it'll look mostly factory when it's done. So that's the block. What are we gonna do to it? Cool stuff. Back in the bad old days, the way to make yourself a really awesome short deck motor was cut down the mains on a 440 crank and shove it in there. Along with a piston to make all that work, the end result is a really neat engine. That's basically what we're doing here, but better in every single way. The stroker kit I'm going to be installing in this engine comes from 440 source, along with the cylinder heads and just about everything else. They've gone to great lengths to make this kit easy to install and easy to understand. This is the crank included with the 440 source stroker kit. It's a very nice piece. Note, the machining looks excellent. Also note this chamfer here. More on that in a minute. These assemblies come pre-balanced. Johnson did go ahead and verify they did a good job, which they did. We're going to install it as it came. Here are the rods included with the kit. They're H-beams. They look very, very nice. They're bushed for floater pistons, and they include ARP fasteners. Again, really good stuff. As I'm laying stuff out here, I have hand numbered the caps and rods just to make sure I don't get them mixed up. In the instructions, it says specifically you are not allowed to use, a hammer type punch number marker or anything like that. You're not allowed to grind on them either because structural rigidity. These rods are provided with a special high performance set of rod bearings, and here's why. Notice it doesn't fully fill the journal area there? That's because this bearing is specifically made to match cranks that have a chamfer here. A factory type bearing is wider and it would interfere with that. You don't want that. With this one, it sits nicely, just like so. It's great that 440 source makes this a no-brainer by including the correct rod bearings. If you're putting a combination like this together, or maybe you're rebuilding one of these 10 years from now, you're gonna wanna make sure you get the correct bearings or you're gonna have a bad time. And now for the pistons. Look at this. It's so small. It's so light. The pin is raised all the way up into the oil ring area, so yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, this forged piston is made by Icon. You can see here the asymmetrical valve reliefs. It is, of course, a floater piston, so it's going to use these spiral locks to retain the piston pin thingy. Because the valve reliefs are asymmetrical, you have to arrange them in left and right. This sets those reliefs up to match the pattern of valves on the head, which is exhaust intake, intake exhaust, exhaust intake, intake exhaust. You don't have to just remember that either. You can just look at the head. Exhaust, exhaust, two intakes in the middle. So make it match that. You can see here why it needs larger release for the intake valves. They're humongous. And since we're already here, we better just take a look at these 440 source stealth heads. If you don't know about these things, they're amazing. They're made of aluminum, and they're a performance unit, but they're made specifically to look just like a factory iron head. So once you throw some paint on these, no one's ever gonna know that they're there. Okay, they'll know if they look at some of the finer details here, but that's not the point. They have coil inserts in all the bolt holes for strength. That's awesome. Standard rocker shaft oiling. Looks great. They come fully assembled with valves, valve springs, keepers, all that stuff. I don't actually know the specs on these springs, but for what we're doing, I'm just gonna assume they're fine. And now for the truly amazing part. We paid $600 each for these heads. Seriously, how are they that cheap? We did have our machinist check these as well, and they're good to go. You definitely want to do that with any set of assembled heads you're ordering. I've heard Edelbrocks are particularly bad, but yeah, these things look really good. I don't think you can usually get an old set of iron heads reconditioned for $1,200 with all new valves, springs, hardware, machining, the lot. These are really neat, really smart money. And did I mention, they're like impossibly light. I don't even, yeah. Super neat. That's so cool. I set this on here to check the dowels. I think I mentioned this in a previous video. I've had issues with heads hanging up on those dowels before, and well, leaky head gaskets are definitely something we don't want on this deal. Looks like it's all good. Well, I have the main mechanical pieces. I'm missing some small stuff. Camshaft, rockers, lifters, push rod. More on that stuff in a minute. One important thing, gasket set. I really need a rear main seal right now to install the crank, and I did find one back here. I also found something neat. Factory Mopar branded replacement steel shim gaskets. On the subject of things that are missing, I guess now's a good time to talk about the cam. I imagine this is the thing people are going to ask about the most, so let's cover that. We're doing a roller conversion on this engine. Honestly, we're doing it for longevity, and so we don't have problems, but also because, well, it's in the budget, and it's way better than flat tappet. Let's talk about what this engine and car are going to be, and what they're not going to be. What they are is a very great daily driver with torque, fuel injection. The car is probably going to be running with stock exhaust manifolds, but the owner wanted some more poop than you could get with a factory 400. But he wanted to do that within the confines of the factory block. So that's kind of what we're going for here. This thing is going to fry tires all day long. It's going to do neat stuff. It's not going to make 500 horsepower. There are much, much more radical camshafts available. And the heads that we're using definitely would have allowed for something like that. But that's not the goal here. We're going to keep it reasonable. With all that in mind, we chose the Lunati Roller Conversion Retrofit Hydraulic Roller Cam, designed for a Chrysler big block, and it's a split duration 262/270. The duration at 50 thousandths is a much more reasonable 211/219. Our lift is 507 intake, 515 exhaust. Again, not a ton. Something in the neighborhood of the legendary 509 Mopar cam. And for lobe separation angle and installed center line, it's 112 and 106. You can see here the advertised RPM range is 1400 to 5400. This is going to make one heck of a street motor. It's an extremely capable cylinder head, an extremely strong bottom end, but a modest camshaft. We want to keep this thing drivable, but it will make all the torque. Also notice, this is just for a cam. They do not currently have a conversion kit available in this number, and we kind of had to look around to get rollers that were going to work on this. Here are the rollers we got. Howard's Cams Retrofit Hydraulic Rollers. We actually got these from 440 Source as well. These are hydraulic conversion rollers, and the full set, $600. As you can see, there are different offerings for differing amounts of money. For rocker arms, we're installing these. These are actually 440 Source's house brand. I'm not sure who makes them. And the full set, $290. They're a 1.5 ratio. They're obviously aluminum. And they come fully assembled for that price, which is impressive. We are going to get a shim kit just in case changes need to be made. Competing brands cost up to like $800 or $900, so, well, we'll see. We probably get what we pay for here. Now a note here. We're not installing these to get the most horsepower possible. We're not installing these to spin this thing to 7,000 RPM. We actually are installing these to get the adjustability, so we can lash the hydraulic rollers correctly to try and prevent valve float and get really nice RPM ability within the confines of our modest street cam, that is. We're also using an Edelbrock Performer RPM dual plane aluminum intake manifold. It's not here yet either. Now again, I'm not going to show you all the little minutiae of putting this engine together. I do want to cover some of the specific things to this build, like assembling the pistons in the right orientation. I've mentioned this before, but the notches there for the bearing shells should point to the oil rail. So I've numbered each rod so you'll see the number when it's in its correct orientation. I did number the pistons. Of course, you'll know they're incorrect when you can read that number. Don't put the valve reliefs that way. Don't ask me how I've learned that either. One peculiarity of this piston design with the pin raised up into where the oil control ring is at, they supply this extra support ring which goes underneath your oil control ring pack. I've never installed those before either, so it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. Someone asked me on the previous build what I thought of full groove bearings. Well, I think they're the right thing to use for a performance assembly like this, and that's what they've supplied here. One interesting note here, the lower rod bearing shells have oil holes in them. They don't go anywhere, and no, I didn't put them backwards. I thought they might have a passage going up to the pins, but they do not. Well, you have to start somewhere, and I've decided to start with piston assembly. Let's put these on the rods. Look at that. This is where your pin oil comes from. Scraped off by the oil ring and shoved in there. That's pretty neat. Anyway, the first step here is to install the spiral lock on one side 8 times. I don't like spiral locks. I prefer the snap rings. This would be a tricky job anyway, but that raised area, because of where the pin is, makes it, I don't know, almost impossible. Steady, and satisfying click sound. Turned out the trick was to work the end up over those ridiculous raised spots as I went. It's easier than it looked. Now to just do that 15 more times. Number 1 piston assembly. Did have to rewrite my number because, well, I wiped it off while I was trying to get the dang spiral lock in. Speaking of which, I still have to do another one. Also, obviously the pin got some oil. Now remember, check everything. This pin has light surface rust spots on it. If it can catch your fingernail, it's bad. If you didn't know, this design is called a floating piston, and the reason for that is that pin in there floats between the rod end and the piston. It's good, less resistance. It's free to move wherever it wants. Obviously you have to have the locks on the end to keep it in place, or it would just slide out, which would be bad. First spiral lock, 3 minutes. 8th spiral lock, 15 seconds. We're getting there. Cleaning of the block and the crank, went ahead and dropped the crank in. Of course, the upper shells are in there, as well as the upper part of the rear main seal. Very pretty. Notice on this one, we're using ARP main studs. If you're going to do that, make sure you follow their torque specs and use their ARP lubricant. One note on these main bearings, they are also tapered on the sides to make sure that that radius has room to live. You can see there, if they were straight, it would be very, very close. Here's a look at the lower shell and the cap, and you can see it quite clearly. Machining mark there. Very interesting. Unlike the factory build, this one has nice, acceptable crankshaft end play. In fact, it might be bordering on excessive, but you know what they say, a loose engine is a happy engine. Mains torqued to the ARP spec, which is 110, not the factory number. Also note, it spins great. Always take time to check that as you're putting your engine together. Now with the crank done, unfortunately now it's time to turn my attention to filing rings. My favorite. On a factory build, chances are, kind of good. You'll end up with a set of rings you can just install. Of course, you always want to double check the gap and make sure it's safe, but that's how it went on my last 440 build. On this thing, well, this is a performance engine, and we need to verify that the end gap ends up within a certain tolerance range, so it's safe. To begin with, I consulted my favorite chart on the subject. It indicates that for a naturally aspirated street engine, what you want to see is 4/1000ths of an inch gap per, inch of bore for the top, and 5/1000ths for the second. I did the math on those numbers and came up with 17 thou on the top ring and 22 on the second ring. Then I went ahead and looked at the total seal instructions, and they indicated that for a street engine, they want to see 4.5 for both. So that gives us just about 20 thou. The moment you add boost or go drag racing, these numbers become completely wrong. So consult the chart that's included with your rings and find the right numbers for what you're trying to do. A 20 thou feeler gauge looks like this. Currently, the end gap in this first ring I've selected looks like that. Clearly there's going to be a problem. We need this feeler to sit comfortably in that gap all the way to the outside. And ideally, straight, not wobbly. So we need to work on that. Now there are a lot of ways to get this job done. You could use a hand file. You could use a hand crank ring grinder. I'm going to solve that problem a different way with this, my Proform electric dead battery powered ring grinder. It also has a mic on it, which is almost completely worthless. Okay, got just a little excited on my test pass, and well, we're probably more like 22, but hey, it's gonna work. Obviously the goal here is to end up with the ends parallel, and you do have to clean them up with a file to remove any burrs or little bits hanging off of there. Now that I've got everything set up and adjusted, this is what the next forever of my life looks like. Look at that, it'll grind it by itself. That's nice. Okay, it's not gonna be 100 years. I got both of them done for cylinder 1 in about 5 minutes. Either way, as you can probably tell, there's a whole lot more to do here. A lot more science to figure out. It has occurred to me that someone right about now is starting to type out a comment asking what this build costs. So, 440 Source, we've given them, well, approaching $6,000 for all of this stuff. It's more like $5,500. I don't know the exact numbers. The point is, the stroker kit's not cheap. The heads are pretty reasonable, but there's a lot of money here in rotating stuff. I'm not saying it's not worth it either. It's amazing. I didn't actually hear the total machine work bill on this block. I know it had to be line bored, and obviously the cylinders were bored, and it was cleaned. I'm gonna guess the machine shop bill was approaching another $1,000. It would have been much more if they'd had to recondition heads, obviously. We ordered the roller conversion camshaft from Jegs, I believe, and it was approaching $500. As you can probably tell, this isn't exactly a budget-conscious build. And that's why I never do builds like this, Most of the engines I put together, well, yeah, the engine that's free, that's the one for me. But this is pretty awesome. And I must say, I'll be tempted to build one of my own if this performs the way I think it will. Hey, look at that. It's a full complement of finished filed rings. Every one of these got roughed in on this machine, cleaned up with a hand file so they wouldn't score the bores, put in the bores, checked with a feeler, then taken back out, adjusted as necessary, and then cleaned up on all 4 sides of each edge. So as you can imagine, that took some hours. Something like 4, I think. Each one of them's been checked in a piston to make sure it slides right in with no problems. Note, these are all checked and marked per position, per cylinder. The gap I was shooting for was about 20 thou. Admittedly, a lot of them ended up closer to 22. And that's not a big deal. You might give up the tiniest little bit of sealing, but, smaller than 20, that would be a problem. Remember to clean everything. This is the gunk I got off of the 2 rings for cylinder 1 alone. The yellow marker was sort of a progress reminder I was using. It can go now. Now remember, the learning curve can be quite steep, so just try not to fall off. I mentioned these oil control ring support rails before. The first one I put in, I just dropped it in there, and I tried to install the expander next, and it wouldn't fit because that rail was all wavy. That's because they have this little dot that has to go in this gap. And speaking of learning, I've learned something since my last 440 build video that I thought I'd pass on to you. That's right, Not only do I not know everything, I'm going to tell you when I'm wrong and when I've gained an enhanced understanding of things. I've been using WD-40 to lubricate piston rings and cylinder walls and the ring compressor for years. That's the way I learned to do it. It's never been a problem. It works great. However, friend of the channel, constant commenter, and member of our Sunday live streams, Rooster, also known as Spanboats, that's his handle, schooled me on WD-40. It turns out that it has some amount of alcohol or something in it, and as it evaporates, it actually attracts moisture to nice, shiny, finished surfaces. He had anecdotal evidence proving that this happens. I went out to my storage building where I put things after my shop closed, and, well, my Magnum block that I doused in WD-40 to try and protect, all the machine surfaces are surface rusty and horrible. Now, that doesn't mean every engine ever put together with WD-40 is ruined, which is good because I got one sitting right here. What it does mean is if you're going to build an engine and then it's going to sit around for a long time and there's any chance of moisture getting into it, I mean, even if it's in your garage and there's some heat, if it's damp in there, bad things can happen. So let this be a warning. I've learned, and you can learn too. Moving forward, I'm just going to use our old friend engine oil, which I use for everything else in this assembly. On the rings, the cylinder walls, the pistons, the thingy. What I'm not going to do, and what I suggest you don't do, is just absolutely douse all of this in oil. A light coating should be sufficient. The reason I've always used WD-40 is it was my understanding that it's possible to glaze your cylinder walls with excessive oil. WD-40 gives lubrication for assembly and rolling the engine over, but it doesn't create a crazy film on there. It's just a light little lubricant, you know? That way, the ring and the cylinder wall can cut into each other and mate, which is what you want, at least if you want your engine to have compression. I've also seen professional engine builders do what I just said not to do and coffee can pistons and drop them in the engine just absolutely doused, so maybe they know something I don't. The long and the short of it is, there are many, many ways to skin this cat, so this is how I'm going to do it, and we'll see how it goes on this one. Look at that. Rotating assembly together. And look at that, the car's back! Because it's been, you know, some days since I started this. I couldn't say this before I got them all in, or I would have cursed myself, but that was the easiest set of pistons I've ever installed. Part of it, it's got no studs sticking out of the rods, it's got bolts instead, so there's less, you know, danger down there. Didn't have to do the hose loop trick, so that's kind of nice. I'm sure a huge part of it is the better lubrication from engine oil. In addition to the car magically appearing, a bunch more parts did. I actually have a full gasket set, an intake manifold, fancy rocker arms, but no cam yet, so I'm still going to have to stop the build here for a while. And rods are torqued. These rod bolts are nothing like stock, so the torque spec, similarly, nothing like stock. ARP and 440 source specifies 63 foot-pounds for these. So, while we wait patiently for a camshaft to get here, I'm going to shift gears and work on a Challenger. I know a lot of people have been wondering what's going on with this car and asking for updates. It is back from the painter, and it looks great. So blue. Oh yeah. I'll probably do an update video once the camshaft gets here and I can get the engine dressed the rest of the way. But maybe I'll forget, and next time you see it, it'll be breaking in on the run stand. You know, the Mopar or no kart. Either way, thank you very much for watching. And remember, don't fall off the learning curve. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask them down in the comments, and I'll help if I can.